Welcome to the Pine-Richland School Board's December 3rd, 2018 reorganization meeting. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Take roll call. Mr. Lyons?
Present.
Ms. Misbach? Here. Mr. Kashani?
Here.
Dr. Campbell?
Here.
Mr. DiTullio?
Here.
Ms. Goebel? Here. Dr. Meyer?
Here.
Dr. Mihalik?
Here.
Mr. Moy?
Here.
Thank you. Okay, this would be where we have a recognition of visitors, but since nobody's here, we'll skip over that and move on to item 2.01, election of temporary president. Do I have any nominations for a temporary president?
I'll nominate Mark. Second.
You don't need seconds technically for nominations.
I couldn't miss the opportunity.
How'd that feel?
Are there any further nominations? If not, if there's no objections, I declare the nominations closed.
Can I see that?
And I'm going to pass this to Mr. Kashani, who already has the script.
Yes. Just in case. Okay, so we shall move on to item 2.02. And I now call for nominations of school board president. And I'd like to nominate Mr. Peter Lyons.
I'll second.
Thank you.
Are there any further nominations?
Can I make a comment? Does anyone want anything to change? Do we need to do the whole process individually?
Why don't we ask that of the president
So
once we vote? The temporary president doesn't want to make that call.
You don't want to make that call? Come on.
I actually,
power.
That's right. Now's your chance.
I didn't even turn it off. It's still
Yeah, we can discuss sort of a consenting the rest of the items. Yeah.
Brilliant suggestion, Mr. DiTullio. Okay, so seeing none, and if there are no objections, I declare the nominations closed, and by unanimous consent, the undisputed next school board president, Mr. Peter Lyons. Congratulations.
I won't be needing that, but thank you.
It's just fun to hit. Congratulations.
How'd that feel, Mark?
It felt awesome.
We got a second and a gavel. You're set for a year.
Thank you all. If I can make a comment before we proceed with the agenda. So, as Greg, as you pointed out, we intentionally, board leadership reached out to the board and tried to intentionally provoke and promote conversations about leadership and roles, committees, appointments, etc. And no, the feedback was very consistent. That said, I don't want to. Somebody wanted to change, and even if it was something as minor as Beatty or Pine Parks and Rec, I want people to feel free that they have the opportunity to voice that or ask for a change. So you know who you all are. Each of us has different roles in the committees and in the external appointments, as well as the officers, seen as vice president, et cetera. So it's a bold move, but yes, we could probably go through it by reading off the names of the current appointees through each motion. Great. That's in the expedience of time. That's something, if anybody has the slightest, remotest objection, or they just like going through motions, please speak now and say, I like going through motions. Let's go through them. And I mean that. I like going through the motions. But I'm very happy in the interest of expediency. Are there any objections? I'm going to read, for the record, Barb, so that you get them, and then when I get to the end of these appointments, we'll make a motion to approve items 2.03 through 2.11. Are you comfortable with that, Barb? Mm-hmm. We buy the book, Howie?
Yes.
Awesome.
We do elect vice president and then do all those, or can we roll vice president?
We can include the vice presidency in this motion. Would you prefer we leave it separate?
I wasn't sure of their procedure or not, so.
We can leave it. So at the conclusion of reading these, I'll make a motion to approve the following items. Item 2.03, the election of Christine Misbach as Board Vice President. Item 2.04, the establishment of the public board meeting dates as indicated. Item 2.05, a motion to designate the Post-Gazette as the district's newspaper of general circulation. Item 2.06, a motion to appoint Dr. Meyer as legislative representative to PSBA. Motion 2.07, a motion to reapprove Ms. Goebel, Jenny, to Beatty Board. Northern Area Special Purpose Schools Joint Committee. Item 2.08, the appointment of Mr. DiTullio as a representative for the Pine Parks and Rec Board. Item 2.09, the reappointment of Ms. Misbach as representative for Pine-Richland Opportunities Fund. Item 2.01, 2.10, the reappointment of myself, Mr. Lyons, as Food Service and Wellness Committee representative. And finally, item 2.11, a motion to approve Ms. Kirk as the voting representative and Mr. Mark Kashani as the alternate to the Allegheny North Tax Collection Committee. Would anybody like any of those motions split out separately? May I have a second for the motion to approve items 2.03 through 2.11 as read into the record?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Opposed? Motion carries. Fantastic. I'll make one of the note. I want to thank you all for your expediency. There's good governance, and there's getting through stuff, so we can move on to good stuff. Item 3.01 is good stuff in my book. Typically at this time of year, we also look at our committees during the reorg. We ask for input from board members about their committee service. Again, we've communicated one-on-one and via email this past week, and so far I've heard no indications that people see a need for a change. I do like where we're at right now. So barring anything else, we'll have a motion to just informational motion at the next meeting with the current committee assignments. So the window's not closed yet, but it's closing. If you would like to see a change, please let myself or Christine know in the next week. Awesome. Mr. Mihalik, board goals.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks. So I don't feel left out. I get to be the one to do the discussion here on the board goals. So thanks. This comes from discussions with Peter Lyons and Dr. Miller about setting the board's role in relationship to the strategic plan and coming up with some themes of how we might want to think about organizing ourselves and then measuring our performance against it in time. And so what we want to do is really spend a few minutes tonight kicking off a discussion about some potential topics. So what is displayed in this section is something that emerged from the conversations that we've had to seed the discussion, so that we can at least start getting things moving down the pike. Anyhow, there are a couple of key themes that we talked about. One was, board training and development. So we've all gone through training this year. It's been very supportive. I've benefited from it enormously. How can we systematize that going forward so that the board can set some plans and goals for long-term stability and improving our performance as board members going forward? So that's one potential item that's there. Another item that we talked about that's potentially fits on in terms of the strategic plan goal setting is program review process. So we're engaged in different levels of program review. One is the policy reviews that we've been doing. The reasons for why this belongs here is that a lot of boards and other school districts when they encounter a situation, may discover that their policy's out of date, and so they're kind of dealing with two things at once, revising the policy and solving whatever that particular situation that might present itself. And so what we're trying to do is get ahead of that. It's built into the process where we review policies on a regular basis so that we're all up to speed on what they are, we're informed, and then the policies themselves are shaped going forward. So there's some more work that we can be doing on how that process operates and how the board sees itself engaged in that. So that's another item. A third area is what we've called strengthening key communities. This is the board's relationship with other constituents throughout the district. One of the things that came out of the survey work for the strategic plan is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the board itself does, what its roles are, what our responsibilities are. And so the items that are under this section are to help us in some ways create our own voice as a board to communicate with key constituencies. So that's everything is you know, what our key responsibilities are. You know, reviewing personnel, fiscal management, and the core values of the district. So how can we work together to project what our board thinks is important in these categories that guide our decision making so that we can inform the larger constituency about what our you know, what anchors us in that sort of decision making. Another thing is getting us more connected with the schools themselves. So getting engaged with schools and meeting with students and sharing our voice with students. So how does a process like that work, and how do we want that to occur? And then, and it's also about visiting, increasing visibility. Also presence at township meetings, so we're representatives in other community as liaisons around the region. So how can we articulate what those roles are more clearly as well? And then the final item there is coming up with a process of how we evaluate ourselves, of whether or not we've actually built these things out on a timeline and what those indicators are. So that's the general landscape of discussion here. And so I'd like to open it up for people to have some reactions, reflections, thoughts about any of those items. We'll take some notes, try to synthesize it, reflect it back, and then what this might require is setting up maybe 1 or 2 additional meetings where a group of us can come together and refine it and set it going forward. So with that, I'd just like to see if there are any other reflections on that. Of how this has been set up here.
I will say to the board, I was fired up about this for several months, and at the town halls I have conveyed that to, we've had a lot of participation at the town halls, and to be able to lift up the board and governance as not only being important, but having a board willing to put their work plan in the strategic plan. There are several things that I think here are best practices. So the fact that the board is pursuing this is a best practice. The fact that we continue to go through policies by batch and ensure we have updated policies that is a best practice. The concept not only of school visitation, but as I see, tying them directly to the things that the board talks about, like in-depth program review, resource selection, implementation. So however this shakes out, the very fact that it's being discussed tonight is a huge positive. This may be the only time I speak tonight, so I will also say for the record, I asked SLT to not be here this evening, not because they don't respect you, they very much do, but I thought this was a night I could give most of them off and not be here, with the exception of Ms. Hathorn, who will capture all of this and communicate it effectively to the key community. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So I just had a couple more specific, maybe ideas or goals, or as I was reading this, because when I was on the board back in 2011, we did do a couple school visitations, and so it was. I think it was good for, you mentioned the students, but also the teachers when we
Correct.
went too.
Yep.
And we didn't get to all of them in 1 year. I think I ended up at like 2 of them, but it was really interesting to do. So I see that affecting with the staff as well, with our presence.
Yep.
The other, I just had an idea with that first one, the under Strength and Key Communities, articulation and communication of board role and responsibility. Last year I used to go to Key Communicator. This year I somehow dropped out and haven't done it. But I remember there was at one point, maybe it wasn't even last year, but when senior leadership was kind of introducing their roles to the community. Could that be a possibility at some point, for a board member or members to be a part of that?
Can you say that one more time, please? I missed that last.
So for board members to be a part of the introduction of their role in the community, or in the, I'm sorry, in the school system itself, when the senior leadership team is, introducing their roles at some point. So that's just one, one venue to
I like
do
it.
that.
Yep. Good. Okay.
So
Temperature check on how are people feeling about the concept of doing this in the process?
Greg, I'm going to pull
Endorsing it, or?
I'm going to pull something that you had said when we last talked about this, was communications of, a likely annual budget communication. Right. So that's in here. It's a bit expanded. So on that third row under strengthening communities, because we think of that as communication falls under that. We're communicating to strengthen our connection to the community, but whatever about the categories. But okay, so let's come back together and decide that, yes, an annual budget email is appropriate from the board and the board's voice. What else is appropriate, and when? If we're talking about not being reactive, we thought, okay, that's what the idea of a communications calendar is. So apart from, Lord knows what happens, we have a work stoppage, we have a special situation with the superintendent where the board has a unique role, but apart from that, what are the 2, 3, 4, 1 time a year when we want to speak in our voice directly, right? We don't have to have that conversation tonight, but the idea of that budget communication made us think more generally, is that the only time? Probably not, but when Matt references other conversations to follow to fill that in, that's where that budget email lives right now, but we'd like to take that and look at that concept generally, as a for instance. So I want to, point that out.
Me personally, I think that there's a couple that make sense. I mean, and Dr. Miller hits it too with his communications, but you think start of year, end of year, budget. I mean, those are the three that kind of jump out to me, And there's obviously it's being covered by the administration, but I think that piggyback, and if we're talking about aligning board goals, the communication can be aligned, but also a separate voice.
That's right. That's that separate voice that I think is the key here, is figuring out how to construct that and let the community recognize that there is a board with a voice, and it's distinct, and it matches up with what the administration is trying to communicate when that makes sense. And we haven't encountered this, but it's conceivable that the board would have to have its own voice on an issue, irrespective of the administration. So how does that, if there's no work that's done in that area, then you encounter a situation without having any prior effort at building something. I'm not stating that this is an explicit goal, other than the fact that the board needs to have a voice.
I would add to part of the communication goal here, it's the other elements. So, for example, we have done school visitations in the last few years, and not just going to a building, but going to look at something specific that's tied in. As soon as the board would engage in that kind of school visitation, that's a perfect thing to communicate about. So instead of it being something separate or different from, all of these letting the public know that the board, I have the number, I didn't add them up, but Barb might know offhand. We have, a couple hundred policies. The community has no one realizes that. They know about an issue pops up and then they ask, what's the policy? But trying to keep a policy manual reviewed and up to date requires incredible discipline, and it requires the board to be aware of things. That's a perfect thing. It doesn't have to be long. It can be a few sentences, but that's a great. So I see this whole thing as being part of the communication if that's where the board sees value.
It was kind of like when I went to see the school within a school over at Eden Hall.
Right.
To communicate along with the other. I guess that would really be the board, though, that would bring that out.
It could.
Or
right.
just like.
That's the thing, is it could. Like, we didn't, but we could if we had a voice for doing something like that.
Because something like that, I think, is very engaging. I think policy review is important, and I think people need to know about it. It's very dry. It's really exciting, but it is important for them to be aware.
Even this is an example, right? So when an issue that comes up that is more controversial, talking about that the board has identified a framework for decision making where there can be disagreement, and then moving forward, that's a huge, powerful lesson.
The DECIDE acronym somewhat lives in this bottom line here, self-evaluation and goal setting. And I took it out because I felt it limited thinking on this topic, because it could be pretty broad, that idea of looking at ourselves and what we do. But it certainly does live there. It's hard to fit into 4 distinct boxes in 2019 to 2020 and et cetera. But it does live there. And so that's part of the work to be done, is to fill that in. In that last row, I'd want to highlight also, and there's some low-hanging fruit here. There's some things that we know we could do, and tonight's reorg is a good example. When I was appointed, my first reorg meeting, I was appointed, Greg, to your role, Pine Parks and Rec. Those 3 words were all I knew about that role for the next 3 months, right? And that's probably about all that's written down on that. Am I a voting member of that? Is it a what? I don't know. So, do we have something? Now, obviously, we speak to each other and new board members come on. That's part of that. But we could define those, and we should, right? What is it? Where does it come from? What's the expectation in terms of communication, et cetera? So, not that hard to do, but would add a lot to our organization. It's definitely internal focused about us as a board, but I think there's a lot of meat that we could tackle there.
Yeah, so we call it, knowledge management, right? How do you manage knowledge so that you can pass it to new board members through the board? That's the zeros. That's the zero section of the board policy manual. How does the board function? What are the responsibilities? Even Pine Park, I think, is briefly mentioned in that 10, whatever the zeros number is. And so what does that look like? That's good. Even the way Mrs. Goebel and Mrs. Misbach have made a point of sharing more Beatty information and being more, I shouldn't say more engaged, but just being engaged differently by lifting information back to the full board. That's a very positive step.
It is, and if that's the expectation, I want it enshrined somewhat. Let's be honest, 6 years from now, the majority of us probably won't be sitting on this board. But have we left a set of guiding principles and practices in place that have elevated the board for the betterment of the district? That's where a lot of this is going.
And I think all this aligns very, very nicely with the Baldridge framework and the systems building framework that defines how well this district functions to begin with.
I think it goes in, like what you're saying, is the sustainability of it. So, and not that it can't evolve, but that at least you leave guidance, directions, whatever. Because Beatty is not just the meetings that we go to. We've done this, this Beatty Awareness Committee, and then and then there's Prof also, and what are the expectations of those? How we communicated it and operated and so on.
But I think there's more for you to contribute there, Christine, because I think your experience on Prof, I've seen it very from the outside, but the that board focused very much on their development, successionship, et cetera. So I think there's probably a lot of lessons that you've shared a little bit there. But
So I'm pledging to serve this board by acting as a conduit or an aggregator or someone who can help collect the ideas and help structure them in collaboration with everyone here so that we can forge something together.
That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
So is this almost, it sounds to me like it's kind of a start of a new committee.
it could be. I would leave it committee of the whole, though, because it's that important. It's a topic, and I agree, so Matt's got that leadership role in there, but I would leave it committee of the whole.
Well, I think this needs to be included as a separate line item
Yeah.
in our individual meetings, in the monthly meetings,
Yep.
or twice a month meetings, whichever, in the regular meetings, if you will. Because this, we can't just put it on.
Correct.
One board member, it has to be all of us collectively. And as they develop, some of these that are single line items, they're going to develop and spread out. You can't do that on one person.
That's a great idea. So we could have it recurring under board business.
Okay.
Definitely.
Okay.
That's a
Yep.
good
Good.
idea.
Okay.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah. I'll prepare something.
And I know
for-
it's only a week. It's only a week before we all come together again, but we'll put it on there. And in the meantime, people can reach out to Matt. We'll definitely have time to work offline on this in January as well, when we retreat and kind of come together. But yeah,
Great.
that's a good idea. I seriously. Is that good under board business? Is that okay, Greg?
I think it needs to live somewhere, because I don't want to be here next year at reorg and go, oh, by the way, how do we do it? So it
Yep.
needs to be somewhere, and not just at a retreat, or every 6 months or 3 months. It needs to be every time.
Ongoing.
We talk about it, touch it every time.
And you're looking even past after it's enshrined. Let's talk on that.
Well, we do it with the strategic.
Correct.
We
Right.
may not do
Yes.
the entire strategic, well, we
Right.
don't.
We don't. We
But
do
maybe
one.
we touch
That's
on
right.
one thing, and we're going to talk about
Got
our
it.
policy review.
It's a great plan.
I
It
like
could
it.
either fit as another component under what we have usually is item 2,
Yeah.
which is the strategic update, or either one. But again, the one of the nice parts about considering it up in the strategic update section is it aligns to where the board fits with the strategic plan, and we get there before people are fatigued. Sometimes at the end of the agenda, it's just human nature. You're more fatigued and it gets less attention. So that's a good thought.
We need by buildings and grounds, no one's paying.
I'm just saying, I'm not saying all the time. I'm just saying sometimes.
I think it makes sense. That's my 2 cents. I think it makes sense.
I think it's a great
And it aligns
suggestion.
better.
Yeah, I do.
I think it's a great suggestion.
Awesome.
Okay, we'll build it out together. Cool.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Item 4.01 is recognition of visitors, but seeing how there is none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting in favor of an executive session to discuss a personnel and a litigation matter.
Second.
Thank you all very much. Have a good evening.
That's good. That's a great suggestion. Really good.
Yep.
Yeah.